What if you were born in ancient Egypt, from birth to burial? The wind that swept across the Nile before dawn was soft, cool, and filled with dust and distant birdsong. As light began to gather behind the eastern hills, the reeds along the riverbanks stirred like ancient whispers. The stars dimmed one by one, surrendering their watch to the golden eye of Ra, the sun god, who stirred once again from the arms of the sky goddess Nut to begin his eternal voyage across the heavens. The river didn't just flow past the village, it flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. In a modest mud-brick home nestled near the edge of a small village, the world was about to change. For one family, and for one tiny new soul. Even the walls seemed to remember. Each crack a story, each breeze through the reeds a forgotten name whispered back into the world. Inside that home, just past the courtyard where a single date palm stood like a silent guard, a woman lay upon a bed of woven reed mats, her face flushed and brow wet with effort. Her breathing came in short, trembling bursts, and her fingers gripped the hand of an older woman kneeling beside her, a midwife, experienced and calm, her linen headscarf tucked with careful precision. She had helped many women bring children into the world, and she knew the rhythm of labor like a sacred hymn. Even the walls seemed to remember, each crack a story, each breeze through the reeds a forgotten name whispered back into the world. A clay bowl of water steamed gently beside them, perfumed with blue lotus and chamomile, and a small terracotta idol of Taweret, the goddess of childbirth, had been placed on the ledge, facing the labouring woman like a protector. The air was heavy with the scent of frankincense and anticipation. The child came just as the first beam of sunlight passed through the doorway. With a cry loud and wet and living, you entered the world. Your skin, slick with birth, shivered at the sudden change in temperature. Your arms flailed instinctively, reaching for warmth and comfort. You did not know where you were, nor what you were, but your voice was strong and sure. And the midwife smiled as she wrapped you in soft linen and whispered a blessing. "May you walk long upon the land of Kemet," she murmured. "May Maat guide your steps, and may the gods look upon you kindly." She placed you into your mother's arms. Though weary, your mother looked upon you with deep wonder. Her eyes glistened. She touched your cheek with trembling fingers and pressed her lips to your forehead. Your father knelt beside her, his heart pounding with awe and pride. He was a farmer, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with strong hands used to bending reeds and hauling clay. But now those hands shook as he touched your tiny curled fingers. Later that day he walked barefoot to the river and lifted his face to the sun. He spoke no elaborate prayer, only a simple phrase passed down from his father and his father's father before him. Ra, grant this child strength and sweetness. Let their name be known to the breeze and to the Nile. The river didn't just flow past the village, it flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. That evening, as the stars returned to the sky and the world quieted beneath the hush of night, your family gathered to name you. Names held power. They were not just labels, but vessels. Carrying your presence far beyond the day, your footsteps ceased. Names in ancient Egypt were never chosen lightly. A name was not just a label. It was a wish, a shield, a destiny. Perhaps they called you Nefru, meaning beauty, or Kemwaset, meaning he who appears in Thebes. Perhaps your name honored a god, Aset, for Isis or Ptahotep for the divine creator. It might have reflected the day of your birth, or the hopes your parents carried, or the memory of a loved one who had returned to the stars. Whatever name they gave you, it was spoken aloud 3 times, sealing it to your soul. They hung a protective amulet beside your sleeping basket, perhaps a wadjet eye or a tiny scarab, and whispered a final prayer into the still night air before laying you down to rest for the first time under the watchful gaze of eternity. You would not remember the first place you ever slept, but it was simple and safe. A shallow basket made from woven papyrus and palm fibers lined with goat wool and soft linen. It sat in the corner of your family's home, near a small shrine built into the wall. There, idols of Hathor, Bez and Anubis watched over you, silent and eternal. Offerings of bread, milk, and blue lotus petals were left before them on a small shelf of stone. A tiny oil lamp flickered beside your bed, keeping the shadows soft and the air warm. Your mother hummed to you when you cried. She held you against her chest as she ground grain or mended clothing. Sometimes she sang to you soft lullabies about river gods and temple birds. Other times she simply rocked you while the sounds of the village rose and fell like waves. Neighbors laughing, donkeys braying, the call of birds overhead. You knew none of it yet, but you felt safe. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Life in the early days was slow and sacred. The rhythm of day and night, the taste of milk and oil, the touch of sunlight on your skin as your mother carried you outside each morning to greet the rising sun. Your first sounds were not words, but giggles and gasps. Your first toys nothing more than carved wooden beads, knotted strings, and tiny clay animals. When you were just a few weeks old, a festival passed through the village. It was the Feast of Opet, honoring the god Amun. Musicians came from Thebes playing lyres and flutes. Dancers with painted faces moved like birds, while priests in white linen carried golden statues past your door. Your father lifted you high into the air as the procession passed, and though your eyes were still learning to focus, you felt the energy ripple through the crowd. Even then, though you were small, you were part of the world's great breath. As you began to grow, your personality bloomed like a lotus in spring. You laughed when the chickens scattered across the courtyard. You reached for the cat's swishing tail. You cried when the wind howled across the rooftops, and your brother held your hand until you slept again. You took your first steps in the dusty yard behind your house. Your feet were unsure, your knees unsteady, but you moved forward anyway. Your mother clapped and cried and scooped you into her arms. The first time you said a word, perhaps Baba or Ma, your grandmother wept with joy. These were the moments the family held close, speaking them again and again as they baked bread or tended goats, as if repeating them would etch them into time itself. The Nile was always near. The river didn't just flow past the village, it flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. Some evenings your father would take you to its edge. He would sit you on his lap and point to the water. The Nile is life, he would say. The Nile is our blood. Without it, we are sand. You did not understand yet, but you would come to learn its moods. The flooding season when the waters rose, high and thick with black soil. The planting season when the fields turned green. the harvest when grain lay golden beneath the sun. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. Every child in Egypt knew the Nile. It was a teacher, a giver, a path to the gods. Your family was not wealthy, but they were proud. Your home had one main room and a rooftop where herbs dried in the sun. The walls were made of sun-dried mud brick, the floors packed smooth. A small hearth stood near the corner, where your mother cooked flatbread on hot stones and stewed lentils in clay pots. Each morning, your father offered a pinch of grain to the gods before eating. Each evening, your family knelt before the shrine and thanked them again. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. Gratitude, they said, was as important as bread. When you were sick with your first fever, your grandmother pressed cool cloths to your head and burned incense beside your bed. She chanted softly to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of healing, and gave you water steeped with fig and honey. The fever passed. You survived. Your mother told you later that the gods must have smiled on you. And so your story continued. One breath, one step, one day at a time beneath the watchful sun. You were no longer the newborn in the basket. You were becoming a child. Curious, wide-eyed, quick to laughter and quicker to tears. You knew the warmth of your mother's hands and the scratch of your father's beard. You knew the shape of your home and the sound of your name spoken with love. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. And though you did not yet know it, your path had already begun to unfold. In time you would walk farther, you would see more, you would learn the songs of the priests and the work of the farmers, the stories of the stars and the meaning of the gods. You would taste sorrow and sweetness, joy and dust. But for now, you slept, safe, small and wrapped in linen, under the painted gaze of sky and spirit. And somewhere far above, the sun god Ra drifted gently across the sky once more, watching, warming, blessing. The first memories of your childhood came not as clear pictures, but as sensations. The coolness of smooth stone under your bare feet in the morning, the scent of roasted barley drifting from the neighbour's hearth, the way sunlight scattered through reed mats that covered your windows, painting golden lines on the walls. Your world was small, but vivid. You were now perhaps 4 or 5, though birthdays were not counted in the way people would measure them in faraway times. Time in ancient Egypt flowed with the seasons, with the Nile's cycles, and with the stars above. You were no longer a swaddled infant in your mother's arms. You had legs that ran, hands that grasped, and a voice that asked too many questions, much to your father's hidden amusement and your mother's visible exasperation. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. Your home remained your centre, a modest structure built from mud brick, with a rooftop you could now climb to with your siblings to sleep under the stars on warm nights. The walls were smooth and cool during the day, warm and gentle at dusk. They echoed with laughter, with small quarrels over food, and the quiet thud of mortar and pestle as your mother ground grain for the daily bread. You slept with your back against a straw-filled cushion, with a blanket woven from linen and dyed with natural colours, faded reds, earthen browns, and the occasional thread of deep lapis blue, a gift from a travelling merchant long ago. Outside your home, the village pulsed with gentle life. Even the walls seemed to remember, each crack a story, each breeze through the reeds a forgotten name whispered back into the world. You were one of many children, some older, others younger, all barefoot and eager to explore. Together you played games with sticks and stones, with makeshift balls made of bundled cloth. You chased after goats, dug channels in the dust to mimic the Nile, and sometimes got into mischief when no adults were watching. The world beyond your small courtyard was like a great open scroll, waiting to be read one footstep at a time. But life was not all games. As soon as your hands could grasp more than toys, you were given small responsibilities. You learned to help your mother carry water jars, not the large ones, but smaller ones made for little arms. You helped gather reeds from the riverbank for weaving mats. You fed the chickens, kept the cooking fire alive, and on some days accompanied your father to the fields, where you sat under the shade of acacia trees and watched as he coaxed life from the soil. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. The tasks were simple, but never meaningless. Work was not a punishment. It was how you became part of the world. Every task done with care was an offering to Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order. To live well, your parents said, was to live with balance. In your home, in your village, in your heart, the stories of the gods were your earliest lessons. At night, when the stars returned like old friends, you sat cross-legged beside the hearth as your grandmother lit an oil lamp and began to speak. Her voice, low and slow, was threaded with wonder. She told you how the world had been created when the god Atum rose from the waters of chaos, how Nut, the sky goddess, arched her back over the world, swallowing Ra each night and giving birth to him each dawn. You learned of Set's betrayal and Osiris's return, of Anubis, jackal-headed and watchful, who guided the dead to their judgment. You loved the stories most when they ended in triumph, but sometimes your grandmother left them unresolved, unfinished, because not all tales were meant to soothe. The gods are like the river, she told you once, touching the crown of your head, beautiful and full of life, but not always gentle. And so you grew up knowing not just joy but awe, not just comfort but respect. Around the age of 6 or 7, the path of your future began to take shape. If your father was a farmer, you might follow him to the fields. If he was a craftsman, you might learn to carve wood or hammer copper into tools. If you were lucky, or born into the right family, you might be sent to learn reading and writing from a scribe, the guardians of sacred knowledge. That was rare, of course, but even in small villages there were always a few who knew the marks and symbols that danced across papyrus like birds. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. Whether or not you would wield a reed brush or a farming tool, your days were full of learning. You were taught to listen to the wind, to read the clouds, to smell the coming of rain or rot. You learned the names of plants that healed and those that harmed. Your mother showed you how to wrap herbs in linen and place them on bruises. Your father showed you how to bind wood with rope made of papyrus and how to speak softly to stubborn animals. Learning happened everywhere. In the marketplace, in the temple courtyard, at the feet of elders. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. There was no separation between the sacred and the ordinary. All things were part of the same breath. Festivals were the highlights of your young life. Each one brought a break from the usual rhythm. They came with music and dancing, with bright colours and baked sweets. On festival mornings, your mother would dress you in freshly laundered linen, sometimes even decorated with a beaded collar or painted eyes of Horus. Your face would be smeared with kohl to protect you from evil spirits, and your hair carefully braided. You remembered the festival of Bastet with special joy. It came with boats on the river, filled with women shaking sistrums and singing to the cat goddess. The laughter of the procession echoed across the water, and the whole village turned out to celebrate. Cats were honoured with garlands, offerings were left at shrines, children were given toys and small amulets, and for a moment everyone seemed to forget the weight of life. The gods, your father said, love joy as much as prayers. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. Sometimes the village grew quiet. These were the days when illness came, silently, like the desert wind at night. When someone fell sick, the healer was summoned. She was a woman with thick fingers, a stern voice, and eyes that never blinked. She smelled of garlic, resin, and old papyrus. She would grind herbs, chant to Sekhmet, and place her hands on the patient's chest. The air would be heavy with incense. No one would speak loudly. You had fallen sick once, a burning fever that made the walls swirl and the floor tilt. Your mother carried you to the healer, wrapped in damp linen. The woman made you drink something bitter, rubbed oils into your skin, and placed a carved lion beside your bed. For days you drifted between dreams and waking, chasing golden cats through fields of fire. And then, like a river returning to its course, you healed. When you opened your eyes again, the world was quiet, and your grandmother was crying softly beside you. "You've been returned," she whispered, pressing your hand to her cheek. Returned. Not rescued, not saved. Returned, as if your soul had gone wandering through the underworld and found its way back. You would remember that for the rest of your life. As you approached your 9th or 10th year, your world began to widen. You now joined your father more often in the fields, helping to carry tools or untangle vines. If your family worked with animals, you learned to guide them through narrow streets, to speak to them with firm hands and gentle commands. He moved with care born of practice. You were old enough now to understand taxes, how grain was measured and taken, how scribes came with their waxed tablets and their quiet eyes. You saw how your father's back stiffened when he handed over his offering to the local overseer. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. You did not ask questions, but you noticed. You began to understand that life was not only about the gods or the seasons. It was also about choices, and about the power some people held over others. The temple priests, the scribes, the soldiers who passed through the village with their polished shields and their blank stares. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Your father never spoke of the palace, but he often looked toward it when he thought no one was watching. And still the stars moved overhead. You would lie on the rooftop at night, hands behind your head, counting the constellations your brother taught you. You listened to jackals howl in the distance. You imagined the afterlife, a field of reeds stretching to the horizon, where your ancestors waited with open arms. Do not lie, your mother reminded you. Do not steal, your grandmother added. Do not forget the names of those who came before, your father said quietly, one night when the moon was full. You didn't yet understand all their warnings, but you knew they came from love, from fear, from memory, and so you carried them in your heart, in your dreams, and in the stories you began to tell others, just as they had once told them to you. You were no longer just a child. You were becoming part of the story, and soon the world would ask more of you. But for now, you slept, and the Nile, ever patient, flowed on beside you. The river didn't just flow past the village, it flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. The Nile had flooded once more. The river didn't just flow past the village, it flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. From your rooftop perch, you watched the river rise like a sleeping god stirred from his bed, its black waters stretching wide into the land, soaking the earth, swallowing paths and fields. It was a time of pause, a sacred time. The silt the river carried was life itself, dark, rich and thick with promise. And with the rising waters came stories, songs, and the return of lessons that whispered beneath every breath. Balance must be kept. You were older now, perhaps 9 or 10. Your limbs were longer, your hair no longer knotted in wild tufts. You moved with intention. You could tell time by the stars and knew which birds heralded each season. But even as you gained knowledge of the world, something deeper was stirring in your days. It began not with grand pronouncements, but with a quiet gesture. One morning, your father placed a small carved feather into your palm. It was not a gift for playing, nor a toy. You recognized it at once. It was Ma'at's symbol, the feather of truth, the balance of all things. And though it was light, it carried weight. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. He looked you in the eyes, his voice soft but unwavering. It is time for you to learn what it means to walk in Ma'at. Ma'at was everywhere. It lived in the way your mother placed a basket on her head with perfect poise. It echoed in your father's silent thanks before lifting the first cup of water each day. It lingered in the temple smoke, in the crackle of the hearth, and in the careful choice of words between neighbors. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Ma'at was more than a goddess. She was the breath of the land, the unspoken order of stars, the river's rhythm, and the stillness between drum beats. To understand Ma'at, your father brought you to the home of the old scribe, Teti, a man who smelled of aged papyrus and sandalwood, whose eyes were dim with age but bright with knowing. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. You will not yet learn letters, he said, but you will learn how to live. Your lessons began with silence. Each morning you sat beside Teti as he ground black ink and trimmed the tips of his reed pens. Sometimes he spoke. Other times he said nothing at all. You learned to be still, to listen to the sound of wind in the reeds, to note how long it took for incense to rise, to watch the way light danced on clay walls at sunrise. In time, Teti began to speak, and when he did, every word mattered. Ma'at, he said, is not always what you want. It is what is right. He told stories from long ago, of judges who refused gifts to ensure truth, of workers who confessed to taking more than their share and were forgiven because they told the truth, of kings who were humbled when their hearts grew heavy. He described the hall of two truths in the afterlife, where the soul stood naked, watched by Osiris and 42 gods, each demanding that a person swear what they had not done. I have not lied. I have not taken more than I need. I have not turned my face from the hungry. I have not caused pain where peace could have lived. You listened, repeating each vow in your mind, wondering how anyone could face such judgment without trembling. Then one day, your mother offered a simpler lesson. You were peeling garlic when a neighbor entered your home, clearly upset. She was missing a chicken, gone without a trace. You knew, of course, that your cousin had likely taken it. You had seen feathers where they shouldn't be. But saying so would cause a stir. So you hesitated, and your mother, watching you closely, gently placed her hand on your wrist. "If you know the truth," she whispered, "and you say nothing, you carry the lie." That evening you spoke to your cousin in private. You didn't scold, you didn't threaten, you simply asked him to make it right. The next morning a chicken appeared on the neighbor's doorstep. No words, no accusations, just an offering and an understanding. Your mother smiled at you and said no more. Ma'at was not only truth, it was also balance. Your father showed you this in the field. Too much water rots the root, he said. Too little, and the plant dies. He let you hold the plough's wooden handle, guiding it in slow lines through the damp earth. When the oxen pulled unevenly, he adjusted their pace. When weeds threatened to overrun the borders, he cut them back. Life wants to grow in all directions, he said, but Ma'at keeps the borders strong. Even in laughter, balance mattered. If you mocked a friend, you must know when to stop. If you ate the last fig, you must offer something in return. If you were praised, you must deflect some of it to others. You are never the center, Teti told you. Ma'at is. One day a storm struck unexpectedly. Wind lashed the village, and rain, rare and startling, poured from the sky. A cart collapsed, a fig tree split, chickens fled, roofs dripped, people cursed. But when it ended, Teti called you to his courtyard and pointed to the puddle that had formed beside his home. Ma'at, he said, is not the absence of chaos. It is the return to peace. Those words settled into your bones. Still, even peace was tested. A dispute broke out in the village over a property line. Two brothers, once close, now shouted across fields. One claimed the other had taken more than his share of land. The other insisted it had always been his. The dispute reached the local judge, a small round man with sharp eyes. He summoned the brothers and sat beneath the fig tree with a scroll, a stick, and a silent gaze. He listened. He measured. He asked no one to swear oaths, but simply said, "What would balance this?" The older brother offered a bundle of wheat. The younger offered a goat. The judge nodded. And the matter was closed. There was no punishment, only restoration. You saw more of these quiet decisions as you grew. You began to notice which neighbors lived with Ma'at in their breath, and which ones walked like imbalanced scales, always tilting, always complaining, never still. And slowly, you adjusted your own steps. When a neighbour slipped, you helped them stand. When your sister's sandals tore, you gave her your own. When an old woman dropped her date basket, you carried it all the way home without her asking. Even the walls seemed to remember, each crack a story, each breeze through the reeds a forgotten name whispered back into the world. Not because someone told you to, not because you feared judgment, but because it was what Ma'at required. One night you dreamed you stood before the gods, not in fear, but in calm. In your dream, Anubis touched your chest. Thoth unrolled a scroll. The feather of Ma'at hovered above a golden scale, and you felt no dread, because even though you were still young, still learning, still stumbling, you had lived with intention. You had begun to see the invisible thread that bound your village, your river, your land. You were becoming part of the balance. By the end of that year, the carved feather your father had given you sat tucked beneath your sleeping mat. You carried it only on special days, festivals, offerings, moments when a choice stood before you like a fork in the road. You no longer needed to hold it to remember. The feeling of it lived in your hands, in your spine, in the way you walked into the morning light with eyes open and heart light. You had begun to live Ma'at not as a lesson, but as a way of being. And somewhere above, the stars turned, the river flowed, the gods watched, and balance held. The air had changed. Not with the passing of a storm or the coming of a new season, but in a subtler way, like a shift in the weight of the sky. You felt it in the stillness of your father's voice, in the way neighbours looked at you now, not with indulgence but with expectation. Even the sun seemed to rise differently, slower, heavier, more serious. You were no longer a child in the eyes of your village. You were ready to serve it. No one declared this aloud. There was no feast, no ritual, no song. Only a gentle understanding passed from glance to glance that the time had come for you to stop learning through play and start learning through labor. It began with a basket of grain. Your mother handed it to you, heavier than the ones you'd carried before. Her hands lingered a moment on your own, not to help, but to let go. You walked to the communal storage with your head high, aware of every step. And when you returned, your father stood waiting with a staff. "Come with me," he said. And just like that, you left behind the last morning of your childhood. The fields were still wet from the Nile's recent retreat. The river didn't just flow past the village. It flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. You had always watched them from a distance, curious but detached. Now your feet sank into the dark silt with every step. Your father didn't speak as he moved through the tall grass. Instead, he handed you a hoe, a length of rope, and a thin stick with notches carved along its side. "Balance the rows," he said, "match the sun." You didn't understand the second instruction until later. He watched you work that morning, correcting your grip, adjusting your stance, guiding you not with long explanations but with nods and repetition. The land taught you its rules through silence, how it welcomed some hands and rejected others, how it hid stones just beneath the surface, how it demanded not strength but rhythm. When the sun stood directly overhead, your father wiped his brow and looked at your crooked line of rows. "They'll straighten in time," he said. But the fields would not be your final path. You had always been drawn to the carpenter's tools, to the scent of sawdust, the quiet tap of chisel on wood, the calm shape of order born from chaos. Even as your father taught you the language of soil, you knew your own heart spoke another dialect. He moved. The decision to apprentice you came after many evenings of quiet discussion. No one asked what you wanted, but everyone watched what you did. And so one morning, your uncle placed a plane in your hand, and a new world opened. The workshop was nothing like the fields. It was shaded, enclosed, but alive with motion and purpose. Light filtered through reed screens in lines like golden threads. The smell was sharp and sweet, resin, oil, smoke. Tools lined the walls like sacred instruments. Planks leaned against stone like sleeping beasts waiting to be tamed. "You'll sweep first," your uncle said. And so you did. For days, your job was to clear away the shavings, to sharpen tools, to carry water, to sand the rough edges of finished pieces. At first, it frustrated you, but over time you understood. Every motion had meaning. Every surface spoke. You must know the wood, he told you, before you ask it to know you. You carved your first peg within a month. It cracked. The second one bent. "Try again," your uncle said, offering no scolding, no comfort, only space. On the third attempt, something shifted. Your hands, tired but steady, moved with more care. Your eyes watched for the grain, not just the shape. The peg held. "Now it begins," your uncle said. But in truth, it had already begun. As weeks passed, your hands hardened, and your movements grew precise. You could now distinguish the different types of wood by scent alone. Acacia was dry and brittle. Sycamore had a softness that invited shaping. Cedar, rare and precious, smelled like the breath of the gods. You began to hear the difference in the scrape of your blade against each one. When you struck wrong, you learned. When you struck right, the wood sang. Your uncle said very little. "You watch well," he once said. It was the highest praise you ever received from him. And it was enough. The village began to notice your work. At first, they came asking for small things. A comb, a spoon, a repaired stool leg. But soon they came with bigger requests. A new table, a dowry chest, a frame for a shrine. You completed each one with the quiet seriousness your uncle had taught you. No boast, no rush, no shortcuts. One afternoon, a woman brought you her son's toy, a little cart with a broken wheel. You mended it carefully, carved a new wheel, even smoothed the edges so it would roll better. The next morning, a bundle of dates appeared at your doorstep. No note, no words, just gratitude, in the way your people had always expressed it. Then came the summons from the temple. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. The priests had noticed your work. A statue base had cracked and your uncle was asked to restore it. This time, he brought you with him. The temple courtyard was hushed, golden with sunlight. Inside, the statue of Horus loomed, half covered in linen. A hairline split ran across its base. It was a sacred object carved generations before. You felt its weight in the silence. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Your uncle bowed. You followed. He touched the crack with reverence, then handed you the tools. "You've trained your hands," he said. "Now train your heart." For hours you worked beneath his gaze and that of the gods. You sanded, carved, and fitted a new base with a precision you had not known you possessed. When it was done, the priests said nothing. But as you left, one pressed a palm to your shoulder. "Ma'at lives in your hands," he whispered. You didn't speak of it, but you remembered it. That night, your uncle handed you a wrapped bundle, a tool set of your own. "You're no longer my apprentice," he said. "You're my equal." You didn't believe it. Not yet. But the next morning, when you stepped into the workshop alone, you did not look for instruction. You simply began. Work, you now understood, was not a phase of life. It was life itself. The days passed in quiet discipline, carving, repairing, sanding, building. You made beds for newborns and tables for elders. You shaped window shutters that opened onto laughter and caskets that closed upon silence. Each task was sacred. Each one mattered. And in this way, you earned not just a living, but your place. You began to teach others. A boy from the edge of the village watched you often. One morning you called him over, gave him a chisel, let him try. He made mistakes, of course, but you saw yourself in his hands. You taught him as you had been taught. No praise, no blame, just practice, just presence. The seasons turned. You marked time not by festivals, but by projects completed. Not by birthdays, but by the calluses on your fingers and the softness in your eyes. Your body grew strong, your mind steady. You learned the value of a straight edge, of a firm wrist, of a quiet breath before making a cut. You learned how to work even when tired, how to stop when frustrated, how to start again with humility. You no longer thought of yourself as a child, and neither did anyone else. During a harvest festival, you sat by the river alone, a tool in your hand and the smell of cooking fires in the air. You thought of your father's rows of barley, how straight they were now. You thought of your mother's hands, still weaving baskets with perfect tension. You thought of your grandfather's pottery, still lining homes long after his death. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. And you wondered what of yours would last. Not the benches, not the boxes, but perhaps the way you worked, the way you taught, the way you loved the wood. Perhaps that would echo longer than any carving. You stood and looked toward the stars. They blinked as they always had, indifferent, eternal. But you knew something they didn't, that a life spent in quiet service, in steady work, in the daily honoring of craft and community. That was not a small life. That was a sacred one. It always began with silence. Before the water, before the drums, before the celebration and shouting, there was the stillness, a quiet that came just before the Nile rose again, as if the land itself held its breath. You would feel it in your chest before you saw it with your eyes. And then, just as dawn opened its first pale eye, the scent arrived, wet, deep, thick with faraway earth. The river was returning, and with it, the rhythm of everything. The Nile was no stranger to you. You had walked beside it as a child, trailing your fingers through its shallows. You had bathed in its warmth, floated on your back while watching ibis skim its surface. You had fetched buckets, guided oxen through muddy crossing points, and once, when younger, tossed pebbles at the tails of crocodiles from a very safe distance. But now, standing at its edge with older eyes and working hands, you understood something more. The Nile was not just water, it was time itself. It was memory and prophecy, a giver, a keeper, a silent judge. And for the people of Egypt, for your village, your family, your craft, it was everything. Flood season marked the turning point of the year. Every July the water would swell. Carried northward from the rains in the distant mountains of Kush, the Nile rose higher and higher until it overflowed its banks, soaking the earth in a blanket of black silt. This silt was sacred. It held the promise of next season's barley. It fed the onions, the dates, the figs, the papyrus. It made the soil rich beyond compare, allowing Egypt to thrive even as other lands withered in sun-bleached hunger. Without the flood, the kingdom would crumble. And so, when the waters came, the people did not run. They gathered. You remembered waking early the first morning the water reached your courtyard. The village was already awake. Children squealed, chasing one another through shallow streams where streets had been. Farmers stood barefoot in their fields, testing the depth, nodding in approval. Priests moved between homes, lifting their hands to the heavens and chanting praises to Hapi, the god of the Nile's flood. Your father handed you a reed bundle. "We give thanks first," he said. So you walked to the riverbank with him, laying your offering where the water met the land. Reeds tied with flax and blue lotus, a sliver of bread, and a small carved fish. Others had done the same. The river looked like it was wearing a garland of gratitude. Behind you, drums began to beat. The festival of the inundation had begun. That evening the village danced. Long mats were laid on the dry roof of the largest house, turned into a stage. Women sang, their voices rising in waves. Men clapped rhythms, children jumped and spun, and elders sat smiling at it all, remembering their own younger feet, now stilled by time. You watched your mother place a woven sash around her waist. You watched your father sway, awkward but joyful. You ate dates soaked in honey and lentils spiced with garlic and cumin. You saw the lamps flicker and the stars spill overhead like spilled wheat. And in that moment, you felt the river inside you, its patience, its certainty, its quiet power. You would carry that with you always. The floodwaters stayed for weeks. Fields disappeared under dark, glassy sheets. The roads turned into narrow causeways of mud and stone. The animals were penned close to the homes. Life contracted, slowed, bent inward. Work changed too. The usual rhythm, tools in hand, hours marked by sweat and sun, gave way to a different kind of labor. You helped reinforce walls, cleaned gutters, fixed water jars cracked from last season's heat. You spent long hours in the workshop organizing tools, oiling wood, sharpening blades dulled from use. Your uncle always said, "Flood season is the time for slow work, the kind that speaks." And he was right. You began a personal project, a chest carved with waves and fish and stalks of papyrus. It wasn't for trade. It wasn't for a wedding or dowry or burial. It was for learning, for legacy, for love. The days were long but unhurried. You found beauty in the simplicity of each one, the quiet satisfaction of oiling a wooden panel until it gleamed, the warm smell of fresh grain steamed with leeks, the laughter of children catching frogs in the courtyard's puddles, the gentle voice of your grandmother telling stories you'd heard 100 times, but still listened to like secrets. She spoke often of the Nile, how it had flooded every year of her life, how her grandfather once saw a crocodile so large it was mistaken for a god, how some years it gave too much and others too little. But it always returns, she would say, just like us. You never forgot that. The flood was not just about survival, it was about reflection. The temples taught that this season was when the gods judged the year's balance. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Had the land been treated with respect? Had the people honoured Ma'at? Had the sacrifices been enough? The answer came in the height of the water. Too high, and it meant the gods were angry. Too low, and it meant they had been ignored. Just right, and the people could rejoice. This year the water was perfect. The priests declared it aloud. And though you did not see them, you imagined even the pharaohs smiled in his distant palace. One morning you sat alone at the river's edge. The water touched your ankles, warm and slow-moving. You carved a small boat from scrap wood and set it adrift. It rocked gently, then found the current, drifting away. You didn't know where it would end up. Perhaps caught in reeds. Perhaps sinking quietly. Perhaps making it all the way to the delta, to the sea. But as it vanished into the silver horizon, you whispered, "Carry something of me with you." And in that moment, you understood something deeper. That the Nile didn't just flow across the land. The river didn't just flow past the village. It flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. It flowed through time. Through you, the end of flood season was no less sacred. Just as it had risen, the Nile receded, slowly, like a retreating army, leaving behind a transformed world. The land beneath was dark, soft and full of promise. Farmers returned to their plots. Tools returned to hands. Scribes began to record tax assessments. Priests offered prayers of closure and renewal, and you picked up your chisel and began again. Not out of duty, but gratitude. You had been given time to rest, to reflect, to restore. Now it was time to create. The first piece you finished was a cradle. A young couple in the village, newly married, expecting their first child, had asked you for it. You shaped the wood carefully, sanding each curve until it was smooth as water, carving images of lilies and stars into the sides. When it was done, you ran your fingers along the final edge and whispered, "May it carry more than just sleep. May it carry dreams." You delivered it at sunrise. The woman wept. The man bowed, and your heart felt full. More work followed. The festival over, life resumed, but not the same life. A refreshed life, a rebalanced life. You could see it in your neighbours, their patience, their energy, their kindness. Flood season had reminded everyone what truly mattered. Not the harvest, not the gold, not the temple. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. But each other. One evening your uncle asked you to walk with him. He led you to a quiet bend in the river, where the water still glistened like obsidian. "There was a time I thought I'd leave," he said. You were surprised. Your uncle was rooted, like a tree. Always present, always certain. "I was young," he continued, "wanted to see what lay beyond the river's reach. thought there was more, and maybe there is, but he bent to pick up a pebble smooth and small. Nothing ever taught me more than this river. You said nothing. You didn't need to. The water answered for you both. As the year turned and the next season began, you returned to the rhythm that shaped you. Early mornings, steady work, family meals, offerings to the gods. The slow movement of time marked not by hours, but by changes in the sky and the earth. But something inside you had changed. You no longer watched the Nile with only awe. You watched it with kinship. Its cycles were now your own. And you understood that Ma'at, the balance of all things, was not a rule to follow. It was a rhythm to live by. Like the Nile. The river didn't just flow past the village. It flowed through your bones, your breath, your memory. It was your first lullaby, and it would be your last. In ancient Egypt, life was hard, but it was never without joy. Joy came in the quiet moments, like a shared smile after a long day in the fields. It came in the first taste of new bread or the touch of cool water on your neck. But most of all, it came when the work paused and the people gathered. Feasting was not just for kings. Festivals were not only for the gods. They belonged to everyone. And so did the laughter, the dancing, and the stories that wrapped around them like garlands of lotus and flax. Your first memory of a true feast came during the festival of Wepet Renpet, the Egyptian New Year. The night before, the sky had been unusually clear, the stars looked sharper. And there, rising just before dawn, was the star Sothis, what others might one day call Sirius. Its return marked the beginning of the flood, and with it, the new year. You awoke to music. Not a slow chant, but rhythm, drums and rattles, reed flutes and clapping hands. The village stirred like an animal stretching after a long nap. Women wore their finest linen dresses embroidered with gold thread. Men painted their eyes with kohl and dusted their shoulders with crushed ochre. And the scent, gods, the scent. Baking bread, roasting fish, fresh herbs, spiced lentils, honey bubbling in clay pots over low fires. Even the goats seemed to walk prouder that morning. You were swept into the crowd like a leaf in a spring current. The celebration began with offerings. At sunrise, everyone gathered at the temple's outer courtyard. A procession formed, priests in white linen carrying trays of food, incense burners, flowers, jars of beer, and statuettes of the gods. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. You and your family carried your own gifts. A carved wooden duck your uncle had made, a basket of dried figs, and a tiny vial of scented oil your mother had traded for. Offerings were not about wealth. They were about sincerity. Each one, whether grand or humble, was placed on the offering table with the same bowed head and whispered prayer. And when the priests chanted, everyone joined in. May this year bring balance. May the fields be full. May the heart remain light. You looked up at your father as he murmured the words. His face was still, but his eyes were shining. When the formalities ended, the real celebration began. You returned home to prepare the feast. Everyone helped. Even the smallest children were given roles, grinding spices, peeling onions, plucking feathers from the chickens. The kitchen yard became a symphony of movement, laughter, shouting, singing, fire crackling, pots clanging. You were put in charge of crushing garlic with your grandmother. She didn't talk much when she worked. She hummed a tune you didn't recognize, low and slow, like the Nile after a storm. Occasionally, she would reach over and adjust your hand. Not like that, she'd say. The garlic will cry if you bruise it. You weren't sure if she was joking, but you crushed more carefully after that. By midday, the food was laid out on reed mats in the shade of the tamarisk tree. There were barley loaves stuffed with herbs and dates, roast duck glazed with pomegranate syrup, chickpeas in garlic oil, onions charred in coals, and beer brewed just days before, still slightly frothy. You sat cross-legged with your siblings, your cousins, your aunts and uncles, and for the first time in your memory, everyone seemed to breathe at the same pace. No one was rushing, no one was worried. Even your father, usually restless, always planning, reclined on his elbow and let out a rare, deep laugh. You held a piece of warm bread in your hands, steam rising from its center, and realized this was not just food. This was gratitude made edible. The feast stretched long into the afternoon. After everyone had eaten their fill, the games began. Children chased one another around the olive trees. A group of older boys set up a wrestling match. Girls tied scarves around their heads and sang songs that told the stories of long-forgotten queens. Even the elders joined in, sharing riddles and tales, some that ended in wisdom, others in outright nonsense. Your grandfather told his famous one again, about a crocodile who asked Ra for wings. No one believed it, but everyone laughed anyway. Later, a storyteller from another village arrived, lean and tall, with a voice like polished stone. He wore a jackal tooth around his neck and carried a wooden staff carved with symbols you couldn't read. He stood near the fire pit and began to speak, and the entire village fell silent. His tale was about a woman who stole the moon and hid it in her hair. She had done it, he said, to protect her people from drought. But the gods grew jealous. They sent animals and spirits to retrieve it, but none could touch her. In the end, it was a child who convinced her to return the moon. Not with threats, but with song. You don't remember all the words, but you remember how the air felt while he spoke, like the world itself was leaning in to listen. When he finished, the people clapped, offered him food, and one man even gave him a new tunic. Stories, your grandmother whispered, are the oldest kind of feast. As the stars emerged and lamps flickered into life, the festival shifted once again. Music took over. Not the slow chants of temple rituals, but the fast, pulsing songs of the people, made of claps, pipes, drums, and the slap of bare feet on packed earth. A girl twirled with a string of shells around her waist. Boys thumped wooden sticks on the ground in a playful imitation of soldiers' drills. The village elder tapped a bowl with a spoon, keeping time. You had never seen your mother dance before, but that night she did. Shoulders swaying, hands in the air, her laughter brighter than any flame. You watched, half in awe, half in disbelief. Your father caught your expression and said simply, "That's the one I married." Not all feasts were loud. Some were gentle, almost silent. You remembered one held during the Festival of the Valley, a day to honor the ancestors. That morning your family rose early, dressed in white, and walked across the river to visit the tombs of your relatives. You carried baskets filled with food, bread, beer, fruit, onions, and fresh-cut flowers. At the tomb of your great-grandmother, your mother knelt and sang a song too old for you to know. It was not joyful. It was not sad. It simply was. You laid your offering with care. You brushed the dust from the carved name, and for a while no one said a word. It was one of the most powerful feasts you ever attended, and you never even took a bite. Family life was a festival of its own. The rhythms of the household had their own sacred calendar. Your mother's cooking had seasons, lentils with garlic in cooler months, cucumber salad in the dry heat, bread every day. Your father had routines, early prayers, midday repairs, checking the roof whenever birds gathered. You knew the sound of your grandmother's sandals when she entered the room. You knew your sister's laugh from down the street. You knew that if your cousin called you by your full name, you were in trouble. This was your temple, your school, your council. That's not perfect, not quiet, but yours. The rituals of daily life were small, but full of meaning. Lighting the oil lamp at sundown, kissing the amulet of Bess before sleep, dripping water from a broken jar onto thirsty earth as an offering. No one forced these things. They simply were. And if you forgot them, your little sister would remind you with the seriousness of a priestess. Even play followed ritual. The games had rules, the jokes had timing, the teasing had invisible lines you dared not cross unless you wanted a scolding, and sometimes even that was worth it for a good laugh. Your place in the family changed with time. You were no longer sent away when decisions were made. You began to join your father in discussions about repairs, about trade, about the behavior of others. You were trusted to settle arguments between siblings, to watch over younger cousins, to speak with guests. You didn't ask for these roles. You simply grew into them, like a tree growing into its shadow. And with that change came a new kind of pride. You were no longer just part of the household. You were helping shape it. One evening, after a smaller feast, a birthday perhaps, you sat with your uncle near the cooking fire, watching the embers pulse like stars. He handed you a cup of beer and said, "You know what the best part of a feast is?" You expected a joke, but he answered seriously. "It reminds us that the world is good," he said. "Not always, not everywhere, but here, with food in our hands and people by our side, we remember." You nodded, and you held that thought like a hot coal, warming your chest from the inside out. Feasts would come and go. Some years there would be many, other years fewer, when the harvest was lean or the politics in the south grew tense, but they always returned, like the Nile, like the stars. And when they did, your family would gather again beneath the tamarisk tree. The food would be different, the children would be taller, the elders fewer, but the rhythm would remain. Bread would be broken, songs would be sung, and your name, your presence, would be part of that rhythm, a thread in the great tapestry, a flicker in the firelight, a memory, living. They were in the walls, sometimes literally, painted in ochre or etched into plaster. They were in the bread dough your sister kneaded with a whispered wish. They were in the oil your grandmother rubbed onto her joints each morning with a quiet prayer. Every room had its guardian. A woven talisman of Sekhmet hung over the cooking hearth to keep flames from turning wild. A small scarab rested beneath the headmat, hidden in linen, to guard your dreams. Even the animals were part of the protection. Your family's cat was not just company. She was a servant of Bastet. Her mere presence was a blessing. You once asked your mother what would happen if the cat ever ran away. "She won't," she said simply, "but if she does, we'll follow." Life moved around the sacred, not in spite of it. Each morning you opened the windows to let the sun greet the statues. Each evening you lit a lamp for Ra's journey through the underworld. During storms you tied a red ribbon around the door to warn off Set's chaos. These rituals were not burdens. They were breath. You didn't always notice them because they were as natural as walking. But on the few days when one was forgotten, a door not blessed, a cup not raised, you felt it, not in fear, but in imbalance, like a song missing a note. So you would stop, return, correct, and the balance would restore itself. Not all gods were loved equally. There was respect for all, yes, but affection was personal. Your grandfather prayed to Osiris every day, even when no one had died. He said death was just another room and it was good to know who was waiting inside. Your uncle honored Khnum, the ram-headed god of creation, because he was born in a year when the Nile rose too high and flooded the town. You came to love Mahat most. She wasn't a warrior or a protector. She didn't hold lightning or raise mountains. She held a feather. And somehow, that was stronger than any spear. Your grandmother said Mahat didn't need to punish because the world punished itself when balance broke. She would trace the lines of the feather into flour, onto mud, even into your palm, saying, light as this, always. You carried that feeling with you, even when your hands began to carry weight. One day your father taught you the house blessing. It wasn't long. It wasn't loud. You stood with him on the roof at dawn. He held a jar of river water and whispered, from sky to soil, from flame to breath, balance in the corners, peace in the center. Let no guest be unwelcome, no shadow unblessed. Then he poured the water across the rooftop's four edges. Every house, he said, should start with an invitation to the divine. Even if no one else hears it, the gods will. And you remembered. You came to believe that the gods didn't test people through grand events. They tested through small decisions. When someone dropped a basket of figs and you helped them pick it up. When your brother shouted and you chose to listen instead of shout back. When you gave your only piece of sweetbread to your little cousin without being asked. That, your mother said, was how Ma'at measured your heart. Not with a feather on a golden scale, but with choices in the hallway, in the kitchen, in the marketplace, in the home. There were times, of course, when you forgot. Times you acted too quickly or selfishly or without kindness. But the gods did not turn away. They simply waited, patient, unmoving, always watching. Your father once told you, the gods don't expect perfection. They expect attention. You found comfort in that. A reminder that it was never too late to light the lamp. Never too late to say the prayer. Never too late to clean the shrine and begin again. As you grew, your role changed. You began to be the one lighting the morning incense. You offered food when your mother was ill. You led the blessing when your father returned tired from the fields. It was subtle at first, then expected, then natural. You didn't think of yourself as a priest, you weren't. But you had become a keeper, not of laws, but of rhythm. You understood now why the gods lived in homes. Temples were for glory. Homes were for trust. You dreamed more often. Dreams that stirred something deep. Dreams that lingered after waking. One night you walked along a river that flowed backward. You followed a jackal through fields of golden dust. You spoke with your grandmother who had passed the year before. She told you calmly that her mat was comfortable and the stars were warmer there. You woke with tears on your cheeks. You told no one, but you placed extra flowers on the household shrine that morning and smiled when the oil lamp burned a little brighter than usual. When your cousin bore her first child, she asked you to carve a protective charm for his sleeping space. You shaped it from olive wood, 2 figures, Taware and Bez, standing side by side, back to back, smiling. You carved their eyes just as you remembered them from childhood, wide, eternal, kind. Your cousin wept when she received it. "It will watch over him," you said. "But who will watch over me?" she asked with a laugh. "The gods," you replied, "and your son once he learns their names." You came to understand that home was not defined by walls, but by what was welcomed inside. Even the people, the stories, the spirits. A home with 5 statues could be cold if no one remembered them. A hut with 1 carving and a simple reed mat could glow with sacred warmth if its fire was tended. Even the walls seemed to remember. It wasn't about size. It was about spirit. And spirit, like breath, must be renewed. Each time you swept the floor, you swept toward the center. Each time you opened the door, you nodded to the sunrise. Each time you returned from the fields, you touched the threshold with your palm. "Still safe," you'd whisper. "Still sacred." One day you helped your friend build a new home. He was recently married, and they were expanding a side room. As you raised the support beams, you noticed they hadn't yet built a shrine. Later, as the sun set, you returned with a piece of driftwood you'd been saving. You carved it simply. A circle, a wave, a feather. Ruta the Nile Ma'at. No figures, no names, just the essence. You gave it to them and said, "This will listen. You only have to speak." Years from now, when your own child would ask what the gods wanted most, you'd tell them to be remembered, to be welcomed, to be woven into your morning and your bread, your laughter and your mistakes. You would point to the feather on the wall, the oil lamp in the corner, the cat stretching in the sunlight, and say, "They're already here. They just need you to notice." You had never seen the pharaoh, not even once. Yet his name was on your tongue before you could walk. His image was carved into the limestone walls of the village temple. His symbol, the cartouche, was stamped into your tax records, etched onto scales at the market, and painted in gold above the entrance to every government storehouse. The pharaoh was far away, miles downriver in a capital you could barely imagine. But in a strange, quiet way, he was always present. In the shadows of your prayers. In the curve of your father's bowed head during festivals. In the silence that followed whenever his name was spoken. He was not merely a man, he was not merely a king, he was an axis around which the entire world turned. Your grandmother called him the one who wears the sun. She meant it literally. To her, the pharaoh was the living Ra during the day, and Osiris after sundown. She told you that when the sun rose, it was because the king's soul had emerged from his palace, climbed the sky in a boat of flame, and scattered night with his gaze. "Say his name when you see the sunrise," she said, "even if you cannot see him." And you did. It became a habit so natural you hardly noticed it. Each morning you whispered it once, softly, while brushing sleep from your eyes, just in case he heard. Your family had never visited the capital. No one from your village had. But you had heard stories. Some came from travelling scribes who stopped to rest on their way between major cities. Others came from barge workers with hands like cracked clay and voices full of river wind. They spoke of wonders, palaces of polished alabaster, gold-leaf doors, gardens with pools wider than fields. One man claimed he had seen a room with a ceiling painted like the night sky, so perfect, he said, that birds tried to fly into it and died. Another described guards dressed in leopard skins, standing so still you'd swear they were carved. You didn't know what to believe, but it all felt impossibly far. Yet the pharaoh's hand reached into your life in subtle ways. You felt it during tax season, when men wearing the insignia of the crown came to measure your family's grain and weigh your bundles of flax. They never raised their voices, but their presence was sharp and cold. Their tablets were thick with calculations. One of them once adjusted your father's count without a word. Your father didn't argue. That's how it is, he said later. We do not fight the river or the crown. Even in your workshop you were touched by him. When you carved anything official, items for temples, ritual tools, shrine adornments, you were required to include a mark honoring the pharaoh's divine name. Even simple reed chests for traveling merchants bore his symbol, scratched neatly into the frame. At first, this felt strange. You weren't carving for the king. He'd never see these things. He'd never touch them. But over time, the habit became something else. You realized you were not offering your work to the pharaoh. You were offering it through him, as if he were a mirror that reflected your intention upward, towards the divine. During the festival of the Sed, a priest gave a sermon that stayed with you. He said the pharaoh had to be strong, not for himself, but for all of Egypt, that his body was the body of the land, that if his feet stumbled, the Nile might dry. If his eyes dimmed, the sun might falter. You didn't take it literally, but still, something about the image stayed with you. That someone, somewhere, far away, whom you had never met, was carrying the weight of your life, and you had never even thanked him. You dreamed of the pharaoh once. He stood in your village square, dressed in fine linen and crowned with a golden uraeus. But he was barefoot, and no one bowed. He walked from house to house, touching each wall, each fence, each gate. When he came to your door, he said nothing, just placed a palm on your shoulder. Then he vanished. When you awoke, the fire in the hearth had gone out. You relit it without calling your father. Somehow it felt like your responsibility. Over the years you learned more about the machinery of the pharaoh's world. You learned how officials were appointed, not always by merit, but by lineage. You learned how grain was counted, stored, and distributed in his name. You learned that temples were both houses of the gods and vaults of royal wealth, that scribes worked not only to record offerings, but to maintain royal law. But most of all, you learned that kingship, true kingship, was not about ruling. It was about bearing. The pharaoh carried Egypt like a father carries a sleeping child across shifting sand, without thanks, without pause, without asking who was watching. You came to respect that. Even if you didn't always agree with the way his soldiers acted, or how his taxes bit into your granaries. The burden was beyond your imagination. Once, during your 30th year, you were summoned to help repair an offering table at a regional shrine. It bore the cartouche of the reigning king, deep and precise, lined with gold leaf. The priest overseeing the task was young, sharp-eyed, and oddly quiet. You noticed him staring at the cartouche while you worked. "Do you think he knows?" the priest asked. "Knows what?" "That his name is here, that someone like you carved it, that we pour wine in bowls and say his titles before every meal." Names held power. They were not just labels but vessels, carrying your presence far beyond the day your footsteps ceased. You didn't answer right away. Then you said, "No, I don't think he knows, but I think he hopes." The priest nodded once and didn't speak again. You came to believe that was the heart of kingship. To be worshipped but never embraced. To be named but never met. To be needed but never comforted. Names held power. They were not just labels but vessels carrying your presence far beyond the day your footsteps ceased. To be pharaoh was to be alone. The only time you saw a royal figure in person was when one of the crown princes passed through your region on inspection. He didn't stop in your village, but his boat passed along the Nile, a great barge with painted oars, linen sails, and guards on every corner. You stood with half the village at the water's edge. There was no ceremony, no speech, just a breeze, a moment, and a glimpse of him. Young, still soft in the jaw, draped in layers of linen and lapis. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But still, you found yourself bowing, not out of fear, out of something older than that. Years later, when your own son asked what it meant to be loyal to someone you would never meet, you said, "It means holding up your end of the world." He didn't understand then. But he would. One day. In time, a new pharaoh came to power. The name changed. The faces on the murals changed. The cartouches shifted. New taxes were introduced. Old debts forgiven. The priests rewrote certain prayers. You carved the new name into temple furniture with careful hands, even as you whispered the old one in thanks. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Because kings may change, but Egypt does not, and Egypt always must continue. When your father passed, you placed a small clay figure of the reigning pharaoh in his burial goods, not because you believed the king would protect him. He moved with care born of practice, a quiet grace that came from years of knowing what mattered and what could wait. But because your father had lived under his rule, had offered prayers in his name, had lit lamps and spoken titles and given his grain, so the figure was not a tribute to power. It was a piece of context, a symbol of the time your father lived in. A thread in the fabric of the land, a chapter of Egypt pressed gently into the palm of the dead. Now, as you kneel before your own household shrine, older bones creaking, voice soft with the weight of memory, you still include the pharaoh's name in your daily offerings. Not for his benefit, for your own, because in this vast kingdom of flood and flame, of stone and song, the only thing more powerful than a king is a people who remember. Love in ancient Egypt did not arrive with a trumpet. It came quietly. It came in the glance passed across a courtyard during harvest. It came in the shared jug of water under a hot sun. It came when someone helped carry your basket without being asked. It came in the space between duty and poetry. Not a thunderclap, but a seed. And once it took root, it grew with patience. You had always known her. Your village was not large. You grew up a few streets apart, passing each other often, at the well, at the market, during festivals, temple gatherings, and funerals. Her laughter was light but rare. Her hair smelled of cedar and reed smoke. She did not try to draw attention, but somehow always had it. The scent of old incense still clung to the stone walls, and you could almost hear the echoes of every chant that had ever been whispered there. Still, for years she had simply been part of the landscape. Then, one year, after flood season ended, she wasn't. She became the focus. You noticed when she smiled at the merchant's goat. You noticed how she smoothed her sister's hair at the temple steps. You noticed how she never missed the morning offering, even in rain. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, it was clear. Your paths first crossed intentionally during the Feast of Hathor. She was chosen to carry garlands for the village altar. You were repairing a wooden platform that had cracked from last year's wine offerings. She approached carefully, holding armfuls of lotus and papyrus. You offered to help, though your hands smelled of pine tar and you nearly dropped half of what she carried. She laughed, one eyebrow raised. "Let's trade," she said. "You hold these, and I'll finish the repairs." "I wouldn't trust you with a hammer," you replied. "Then we're even. I wouldn't trust you with flowers." The banter began. So did the walk home. Courtship in your village did not follow a script, but it followed a rhythm. There were visits. You brought her family small gifts, woven mats, dates, a carved figure of Bastet that you claimed was for the family cat. Her father nodded, quiet and unreadable. Her mother smiled with a look that said, "I know what this is." She brought your family fresh-baked barley loaves and a scarf, plain but hand-dyed. And once, unannounced, she returned your younger brother home when he scraped his knee by the canal. No promises were spoken, but they were written in every small act. The first time you touched her hand was when you passed her a water jug. Your fingers grazed. She didn't pull away. Neither did you. The moment passed, but it stayed with you all night. You told your sister. She only smiled. When you finally asked her if she would share your household, she did not say yes. She said, "Where your gods sit, I will place mine. Where your lamp burns, I will sit beside it. Where your tools rest, I will not disturb them." Then she added, "But don't expect me to sweep the courtyard alone." You laughed. Then you told your parents. Marriage was not sealed with rings or formal scrolls in your village. It was sealed with intention, with agreement, with the building of a life, stone by stone, habit by habit. The families gathered beneath the tamarisk tree. A priest was invited, not to command the union, but to bless it. 2 jugs of water were poured into a single bowl. Dates were shared. Bread was broken. And then a feast. Simple, fragrant, joyful. And afterward, her hand in yours. Not as someone to chase, but as someone to build with. Your home was small, but after she arrived, it felt larger. Not because of space, there was little of that, but because it now carried a new kind of sound. Her footsteps at dawn, her voice humming in the courtyard, the soft rustle of fabric as she folded the laundry under the shaded awning, the shared breath when you both knelt before the household gods. It was no longer your home, it was yours together. She brought change in small but permanent ways. The shrine was cleaned more often. Her tiny Isis figurine was added beside your tar. The mat under the fire pit was replaced with one she wove herself. Tighter, flatter, less prone to curling. She didn't ask permission. She simply lived. And in doing so, the house shifted toward her. Not in surrender, but in balance. You carved her a small comb of olive wood with flowers etched into the spine. She stitched you a work sash dyed with crushed pomegranate and saffron. You began to sleep closer to the shrine. She began to drink your tea even though she hated anise. No one taught you these things, but you learned. There were disagreements, of course, about grain, about your younger brother overstaying his welcome, about her cousin who talked too loudly at supper, once about whether a fish was undercooked. She never shouted. You sometimes did. But every night you still shared the same lamp, still made offerings to the same gods, still placed 2 cups out, never one. That was the covenant. In time your family grew. She bore you a daughter and then a son. The births were difficult. The midwife stayed for 2 days each time. You waited outside both times, gripping Bess's figurine so tightly the painted colour rubbed off. When your daughter cried for the first time, you wept into your shawl. You had never heard a more sacred sound. She nursed them beneath the tamarisk tree. You carved them toys from scrap wood. She showed them how to sing to the birds. You showed them how to wash their hands before stepping near the shrine. Together you taught them balance, and they grew strong. You watched her become a mother with awe. She was firm but fair, gentle but never weak. She prayed aloud when the children were sick. She sang when they were quiet. She yelled only when necessary, and when she did, the entire courtyard seemed to listen. You thought you loved her before, but now you revered her. As your children aged, your love ripened. It was no longer filled with newness, but with depth. You didn't need to speak to be heard. You didn't need to ask to be understood. You didn't need to fear silence, because in her presence, even stillness was full. Together you aged. The lines around her eyes deepened. Your back began to ache after long work days. Her hands grew rougher from kneading, washing, weaving. You learned to rub oil into her knuckles each night without being asked. You added a second room to the home, not for space, for breath. Your daughter moved out, married. Your son took up a trade. But even as the house grew quiet again, it never felt empty, because she was still there, and she had become its rhythm. Once, while repairing a wall, you carved her name into a brick before sealing it in place, not because anyone would see it, but because you wanted the house to remember. And when you told her, she didn't say anything. She only placed her hand on your shoulder and stood beside you in silence. The final offering you made together was on your 50th shared harvest. You both knelt before the gods, lit incense, poured beer into the clay dish, laid out bread and dates. And then she turned to you and said, "Everything we built is still here, even the things that faded." You didn't reply. You didn't need to. because it was true. You had once thought love was a spark, a thing to chase, to capture. Now you knew better. Love was what remained when the chasing ended, what held its shape in silence, what bent with the seasons but never broke. It was the thread in the mat, the line in the carving, the breath between two prayers. And in her presence, always, you found your balance. It began slowly, not with pain, but with pause. You would wake and sit longer at the edge of your mat. Your hands took a moment more to close around tools. Your breath, once unthinking, arrived with more presence, fuller, slower, heavier. And the gods, who had always felt close, now felt closer still. Not because you feared them, but because you began to feel yourself shifting toward their world, one silent step at a time. The first time you felt ill, truly ill, was during a dry winter. The wind came hard from the desert that year, carrying sharp dust and whispers of drought. The Nile shrank low, exposing sandbars that hadn't been seen in decades. People coughed behind their hands. The bread was thinner, the light harsher. Your bones ached in ways that did not ease with rest. Your stomach turned without cause. Your thoughts scattered, then slowed. You lay on a reed mat by the fire, wrapped in your wife's shawl, and watched the flame flicker like breath from another world. Your family gathered quietly. They did not cry. Egyptians did not fear death the way others might. They prepared for it, spoke of it openly, laid out shabtis and oils and linen in advance. To die well was a kind of art. But still, your son placed a wet cloth on your head. Your daughter offered you dates sweetened with honey. Your wife lit incense and sang the hymn to Hathor in a low, steady tone. And you listened, and you wondered, would this be the last illness, or simply a rehearsal? That night you dreamed of the Hall of Two Truths, not as a story, but as a place. You stood barefoot before Osiris. Anubis held your heart in one hand, Ma'at's feather in the other. Thoth dipped his pen in ink and waited. And you felt peace. You awoke not afraid, just aware. You recovered, not fully but enough. You rose again, moved again, carved again, but you moved differently. Not slower, more consciously. Every step had weight, every gesture a softness. You no longer took your breath for granted. It had become sacred. You began to notice signs of change in others too. Your wife's hands, once smooth and quick, now trembled when tying her sash. Your brother forgot the names of spices he'd grown his whole life. Your neighbor, once strong enough to carry a grain sack alone, now needed help lifting a child. No one spoke of these changes in shame. They simply adapted. They wove their lives tighter, leaned on one another more, and in doing so, they grew closer. You started sharing more of your skills, teaching younger men how to read grain, how to repair wheels, how to carve for ritual, not just beauty. At first, they rushed. You made them slow down. Every object outlives you, you said. Make sure it knows your name. You found new rhythm in simplicity. Morning prayers became longer. Work became lighter but more precise. You took breaks not out of exhaustion but reverence. Each breath was a small ritual, each touch a prayer, each meal an offering. Even walking from one end of the village to the other became a kind of procession, greeting familiar faces, accepting help when offered, giving blessings as though they were grain. When your closest friend died, it was not unexpected. He had aged as you had, gracefully, stubbornly, with a quiet wit that had grown sharper even as his sight faded. He fell ill in the middle of harvest season and passed under the stars with a smile on his face and one hand gripping a worn reed flute. At his burial, you carved a prayer onto a stone and placed it by his head. It read, "He remembered others. Now we remember him." And you wept, not for his death, but for the space he left, a space shaped like his laugh, like his walk, like the way he always corrected your grammar when telling stories. Loss did not hollow you. It made you hollow and full at once, a paradox that your gods understood well. Anubis, who was silent but steady. Osiris, who died and rose and ruled the dead with mercy. Ma'at, who never promised a life free of sorrow. Only that sorrow, too, could be part of balance. Your wife's health began to fail before your own. She had lived well, fully, borne 2 children, managed a household, run the affairs of your small corner of the village with a precision the scribes would envy. But now, her steps slowed, her hands grew tired, her dreams became distant things. You cared for her the way she had once cared for you, wiping her forehead, singing at her bedside, lighting lamps each evening. She never once asked, "Why me?" She only once whispered, "Not yet." And you held her hand as if that might delay time itself. When the end came, it was like sunset. Not a collapse, a fading, a soft fall of shadow. You sat beside her as she exhaled for the last time. You spoke her name to the flame. You poured water eastward at dawn. And you touched each household god and said, "She returns to you now." Then you wept, aloud, unashamed. And the house did not feel empty. It felt honest. The days after were quiet, but not still. Friends came with food, song, help. Your daughter arrived with both her sons. Your son visited from his post along the Nile, bringing herbs and clay and a promise to stay for as long as you needed. But most of all, they brought memory. They spoke of her laugh, her stew, her arguments with the market seller over figs. They imitated her walk, her exacting tone when correcting a child, her prayer voice, so different from her daily one. And slowly, through their stories, she lived again. Grief became a companion. It sat with you during meals. It watched you carve alone. It whispered when you touched the shawl she left folded in the corner. But it also gave you strength to speak her name clearly, to teach her grandchildren her favorite lullaby, to repair the shrine and place her statue in the center, carved in your own hand. Now, in the twilight of your own life, you speak of death without dread. You know it walks closer now, not as a thief, but as a ferryman, one you'll greet with respect, not fear, because you have lived, because you have given, because you are remembered, even now. You've told your children where your burial cloth lies. You've written your own name into a wooden box you made decades ago. You've stored your wife's final letter in it, sealed in wax, to be read only after. and you've left instructions that incense be burned not only for you, but for all who forget to grieve themselves. You wake each day as a gift, not with expectation, but gratitude. Each wrinkle is a map, each scar a memory, each sigh a verse of an unfinished hymn. You rise slowly, you eat slowly, you speak less, but when you speak, people listen, because time has tuned your voice like an instrument, and the world leans closer. One morning, as you pour water eastward, you speak aloud. To the ones I love, to the ones I lost, to the one I soon will meet. Let me walk light. Let me walk true. Let me be remembered in peace. You finish the prayer, drink the rest of the water, and step into the day. The sun is warm. The wind is soft. The gods are quiet, and everything is as it should be. In Egypt, death was never an end. It was a passage, a crossing, not feared, not rushed, not welcomed blindly, but prepared for with the same care as one prepared the harvest or shaped a home. You did not run from it. You made room for it. And now, in the last chapters of your life, you began to set the table. It began, as many sacred things do, with quiet work. You swept your courtyard, repaired a crack in the outer wall, polished the shrine without being asked. You pulled weeds from beside the tamarisk tree where your wife had once sat shelling beans with your daughter. You straightened the mat by the door, not for visitors, for the gods, for your ancestors, for whatever would come next. Your children noticed. They didn't say it aloud, but you caught their glances when you spoke more slowly. When you asked to hear a story you'd already heard. When you sat beside them, not to teach, not to correct, but just to be there. They helped with the chores, sat longer after meals, brought you small things without comment, a bowl of figs, a new piece of thread for your robe, a comb with smoothed teeth. They too were preparing. Your tomb goods had long been planned. Years ago you carved your own burial box, plain cedar with a single feather of ma'at etched into its lid. Inside you'd already placed a folded cloth from your wedding, a clay figure of tar, a letter written in your wife's hand before her final illness, and a small flute from your childhood. Not treasures, but truths. You added one more item last week, a smooth stone you found near the Nile, shaped by time into a perfect oval. You didn't know why it felt right, but it did. Your son asked one evening if you were afraid. You were sitting under the stars, watching the constellations spin above the reeds. You shook your head. I've seen enough births to know what beginnings look like, you said. This feels like one. He said nothing, but stayed beside you until the dew began to fall. You began to speak to the gods more directly, not through long chants or incense-heavy ceremony, but through conversation. At dawn you greeted Ra with a nod and a murmur, still here. At dusk you whispered to Osiris, when you're ready. You touched Bess's carving when the nights grew long, and you pressed your thumb to Mahat's feather when your hands trembled. And the gods, as always, remained silent, but present. You didn't ask for more time, only for clarity, only for steadiness. The village knew. They didn't speak of it directly, no one said soon or he's near, but they made space for your slowness. Neighbours left offerings at your shrine. Old friends sat beside you without needing to fill the air. The priest stopped by weekly, not to recite scripture, but to ask about your dreams. Dreams mattered now more than ever. You had begun to keep track. In one, you walked barefoot across a shallow lake. In another, you opened a door inside a stone wall and found your wife tending a garden that bloomed in moonlight. Once you held your mother's hand, though she had been gone for decades. You didn't try to explain them. You simply remembered. And that was enough. The priest offered to begin the final rites. You accepted, not in haste, but in gratitude. Together you prepared the Hetepti Nesu, the offering formula, food, drink, and incense for your soul's journey. You named the gods you wished to welcome you. You composed your list of misdeeds and counterbalanced them with good deeds. Not to boast, but to bring your heart closer to Ma'at's scale. You recorded what you wished for your family, that your daughter be seen for her wisdom, that your son speak your name often and gently, that your grandchildren laugh often and without burden, that your home remain open to light. You cleaned your body yourself one final time. You did not ask for help. You filled the basin with water, anointed your limbs with oil, combed your hair, and placed a simple linen robe over your shoulders. Then you sat beneath the tamarisk tree and watched the last light of afternoon catch the curve of your courtyard wall. It was not farewell. It was witnessing. You were saying to the world, I was here, I loved it, I leave nothing unspoken. The final night came quietly. No thunder, no sudden collapse, just a slow breath, a soft dimming. You laid upon your mat facing east. Your daughter sat beside you, reading from the book of Going Forth by Day. Your son held your hand. A lamp burned low near the household shrine. And as your eyes closed, you remembered something your wife once whispered to you. When you step beyond, walk like it's still your home. And so you did. Your body was wrapped with care. Your box sealed with prayers. Your name spoken at every step of the journey. You were buried beside your wife, beneath the flowering tree that had once shaded your wedding feast. Offerings were left at your tomb. The priest spoke your formula aloud. A voice offering of bread, beer, cattle, fowl, linen, and incense for the car of... And your name, shaped by decades of living, was given back to the earth. But you did not vanish. Your granddaughter spoke to you while feeding birds. Your carving hung on the wall of the workshop, where it caught the morning sun. Your story was told to the next apprentice. He once carved this with nothing but a bent chisel. Your son poured water eastward each morning and said, "Still here," because that is how Egyptians crossed the threshold, with grace, with preparation, with love, and with the knowledge that death was not a thief, but a doorway. Long after your footsteps faded from the courtyard, your presence remained. It lived in the rhythm of the home, in the way someone opened the door slowly at dawn, in the way the tools were hung, in the same order on the wall. It lived in the grain of wood, in the sweep of broom bristles, in the light that pooled beneath the tamarisk tree. You had passed into the next world, but your story hadn't ended. Because in Egypt, a name spoken is a name alive. Your granddaughter whispered your name when her first child was born. Your son murmured it under his breath when he carved a door frame and struggled to get it straight. Your daughter, now silver-haired and soft-spoken, made a point to tell the priest your favorite food each year during the Festival of the Dead, not because it was required, but because forgetting was unthinkable. Legacy did not mean greatness. It meant consistency. It meant compassion. It meant presence, multiplied through the lives you had touched. You had not been a scribe who recorded royal battles. You had not built a palace wall or chiseled the name of a god onto a temple pillar. You had carved beds that let people sleep, chests that held wedding clothes, toys that taught children the joy of balance. And because of this, you had not just lived in time, you had entered it. In the years that followed your burial, your home evolved. New walls were added, doors replaced. The outer courtyard now held vines that your great-granddaughter planted. But the shrine remained, untouched but for fresh oil, fresh offerings, and a small woven mat placed under your statue. Someone had made it by hand, and they had done it well. A boy from a neighboring village once visited and asked, "Who is that?" when he saw your image carved beside the fire. Your great-grandson answered with pride, "That's my mother's grandfather. He built this house." The boy had nodded, unimpressed. But later, when the wind howled and the door didn't shake, when the cooking fire burned steady, when the basin drained cleanly, he said, he must have done it well. And your name grew one more root into the world. Some of your sayings became household wisdom. Balance the tool before the strike. Praise the gods, but also sweep the floor. A carved edge can outlast a careless tongue. Your children quoted them. Then their children did. At first your name followed. Then, eventually, it didn't. The words became part of the walls, of the breath shared between generations. But that was all right, because to become nameless within wisdom was still to be eternal. Your belongings wore down, but slowly. The comb you once carved now rested on the shelf above a basin, its teeth dulled by years of use. The stool you built for your daughter was missing a leg, but she never repaired it. She said it reminded her that not everything perfect needs to stay that way. Your chest still held wedding linens, though moth-eaten and faded. But when your great-granddaughter opened it once, she said it still smelled like cedar and river wind. And that meant you were still there. In time, a flood washed part of the village away. New homes were built, roads shifted, trees fell. But your shrine, your small carved shrine embedded into the eastern wall of the home, remained. Not because of luck, but because it had been built to face the sunrise. Because it had been cleaned with care. Because the people in that home believed in preserving what mattered, even if they didn't remember why at first. New names came into the family. New gods were added to the altar. New stories were told beside the fire. But when the priest recited the list of ancestors each year, yours remained near the top, not from seniority, but because your descendants kept adding the offerings you once loved, dates soaked in honey, a single polished stone, a folded cloth, and always water poured eastward. Your great-great-grandson grew into a craftsman. No one pushed him toward it, but he found your tools in a trunk and asked how to use them. He sharpened your old chisel and carved a bird that looked like it might take flight. He asked who you were, and when he heard, he smiled and said, "So that's where I come from." And in that moment he carried you forward, not as a statue, but as a motion. Eventually the house aged, walls crumbled, roofs leaked, the family moved upriver, but your shrine was carefully removed, taken stone by stone, and placed in the new home. There it was rebuilt beside a window. And when the sun rose, it struck the same part of your statue's cheek that it had a century before. Because memory, true memory, does not fade. It finds new light. Centuries later, a man uncovered a wooden comb in the soil near the site of your old village. He didn't know who made it, but he turned it in his hand and said, "Whoever shaped this cared." And in that moment, your fingers touched the world again. Because in Egypt, the soul is made of many parts. One is the ka, the life force. One is the ba, the spirit that can travel and visit. One is the ren, the name. And one is the sekhem, the power that echoes even after the body is gone. Your sekhem moved through children and stories, through doors and shadows, through laughter and tools. It lived in breath, in the offering, in the pause someone took before lighting the morning flame. And so you did not die. You returned, not as yourself, but as presence, as silence with meaning, as a rhythm repeated, in the pattern of braided hair, in the careful sweep of a clean floor, in the way a carving begins with breath. You were not remembered as a man. You were remembered as balance. And so your journey did not end in the tomb, nor in the shrine, nor in the memory of those who directly knew your face. It continued in the shaping of hands, in the stories told over simple bread, in the rising of the sun on another day, where someone would wake, light the fire, and pour water eastward.